Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The head of King Louis XVI. The French Revolution was a pivotal moment in history as the civilian population around the country rose up and sought to abolish their monarchy. No one would have anticipated the bloodshed that occurred after, as the Reign of Terror emerged across France with around 17,000 people being led to the guillotine inside of different cities and towns. Dozens a day were being executed as figures such as Robespierre wanted to stomp out every piece of the monarchist sympathy as they could. But this was in the aftermath of the execution of the French King Louis XVI, and he was a king who was not perfect, and he attracted a huge amount of hatred and criticism from his subjects. But Louis XVI would be led to the guillotine himself, where an executioner took his head clean off. But following his death, a mould of his head would be cast, and this was done by the infamous Madame Tussaud, and it shows a rather haunting image of the king in his final moments. King Louis XVI was the last king of France, and along with his wife Marie Antoinette, the Queen, the royal couple attracted a huge degree of criticism. Whilst the French people were starving due to the rising prices of bread, the monarchy was spending lavish sums of money on furniture, parties, and they were gambling away huge amounts of the treasury. Because of the anger, revolution broke out with key events such as the storming of the Bastille, destabilising the monarchy, and eventually the king and queen and royal family were taken into custody. There have been conversations across Europe regarding saving them, but the increasing tension towards them saw the king brought to trial. He was forced to abolish the monarchy, and France became a republic. Louis was himself brought to trial, and he would be brought from the Temple prison to stand before the National Convention. He was accused of high treason and crimes against the state, and on the 15th of January 1793, 721 deputies and members of the convention voted on what to do with him. 693 declared that he was guilty. But the men then had to decide what to do with the king. 361 of them voted for execution, and Louis XVI was condemned to death by one single vote. The immediate execution of the king was then arranged, and this would be the final decision. His execution took place on the 21st of January 1793. On the day, Louis woke up early in the morning. His valet helped him dress, and he then visited an Irish priest to make his confession. He would hear his last mass and receive communion, but Louis was advised to not see his family as it would be too tough. He then confided his final wishes to the priest, that the royal seal was to go to the Dauphin, and that his wife the Queen should receive his wedding ring. Following the blessing, he went to meet the commander of the guard. In the second court, a green carriage was waiting for him, and he then sat in it along with the priest and two guards who sat opposite. The carriage then left the temple at 9 a.m, and for over an hour, the carriage, which was led by drummers, would process to the place of execution. The drummers played to drown out the sound of any support, and the route to the guillotine was lined by 80,000 soldiers of the National Guard. They were also escorted by cavalry soldiers with their sabres drawn. One supporter of the royal family had gathered a force of 300 men in the neighbourhood of Rue de Cléry. However, he was then discouraged as the men changed their support. At 10 o'clock, the carriage carrying the king emerged at the Place de la Révolution and went towards an area where the scaffold had been erected, where the guillotine was set upon. The guillotine, as a device, was created to execute people as quickly as possible, and the king would give his approval to this years before, but he would never have imagined that his royal patronage would lead him to losing his head on the device. In the square were many guards who surrounded the scaffold with guns, and a crowd carrying pikes and bayonets were also found. His confessor wrote of the journey. The path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when, arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard at the Pont Tournant, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Louis XVI then disembarked his carriage and coach, and he was then approached by the executioner, Charles Henry Sansom, who would perform the job. He would, to begin with, not allow the executioner and his assistant to bind his hands together and tie them, but he would then give over when Sansom suggested using a handkerchief rather than a rope. The executioner's men then quickly cut his hair and removed the collar of his shirt to ensure that nothing got snagged in the blade of the guillotine that would prevent a clean cut. He was then led up the scaffold. Whilst on it, he shouted to the crowd and proclaimed that he was innocent, but then a drum roll was ordered to drown out the final sentences and send him towards his death. The executioners then fastened the king to the guillotine bench, and they then positioned this beneath the device to hold it into place. Then, rather rapidly, the blade was released and the king's head was taken off. One eyewitness stated that the blade did not sever the neck, but due to a misalignment, the blade went straight through the back of his skull and into his jaw. But then Sansom grabbed the severed head from the basket, which it fell into, and showed it to the crowd as the people rushed forwards to dip their handkerchiefs in the blood of the deceased former king. The executioner would later state of the execution: "Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked Sanson why the drums had stopped beating. He came forwards to speak, but there were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, 'My people, I die innocent.' Then, turning towards his executioner, Louis XVI declared, 'Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French.' The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sansom showed the head of Louis XVI to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la nation! Vive la République!" arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Another witness would state, "Here are some unknown details. The executioners numbered 4. 2 only performed the execution. The 3rd stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the 4th was on the wagon which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold. The executioner wore breeches, coats in the French style, as a revolution had modified it, and 3 cornered hats with enormous tricolour cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Sansom, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. But then, after the execution, at some point, Marie Tussaud, or Madame Tussaud, was then employed to make a death mask or whole body cast of the executed king, Louis XVI. She would also do the same for Marie Antoinette and other prominent French politicians, and she would have done this before his body was interred. This is interesting, as the king's remains were immediately transported to the Church of Madeleine, as he was not allowed to be buried alongside his father. He was buried in a sense as a commoner, but at some point Madame Tussaud would have had her hands on the head of the dead king. This would have been done possibly whilst he was still on the scaffold, or in the seconds after, or inside of the cart, when his remains were taken to the church. With Marie Antoinette, she would have to sneak into the graveyard to do this, but the head crafted of King Louis XVI would show him in his final seconds, and the countenance of the king following the blade falling. It was said of his burial, "Arriving at the cemetery, I called for silence. A detachment of gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by earth, the whole being firmly and thoroughly tamped down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet. But King Louis XVI's death was a momentous moment in history, as it signalled the intent of the French Revolution. His wife would also lose her head on the guillotine, but so would thousands more who supported the monarchy. It was a brutal time across the land, and those who would witness executions would see the streets of cities and towns running red with the blood of the victims. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.